He stood in the stark hospital hallway, eyes blazing. "That child isn't mine," Marcus Donovan shouted, pointing at the baby in Ella Robinson's arms. Silence swallowed the hall. Nurses paused. Visitors gasped. But when Marcus looked again, something about the infant's face unsettled him, tore a crack in his certainty. What he saw in those pale gray eyes was more than resemblance. It was blood, legacy, the truth he had sworn would never exist. Ella's lips trembled. The baby's cry echoed against the cold walls. Marcus's chest tightened, breath caught. He had built his empire on control, on being untouchable. But the moment he recognized his own features gazing back, everything began to slip. This is not just a story about betrayal. It is a story about power, denial, and the dangerous cost of truth when one man believes money can erase the past. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How did a man like Marcus Donovan, a self-made millionaire with a reputation polished to perfection, end up cornered in a hospital corridor, denying the very blood that carried his name? How did Ella Robinson, a quiet maid whose only crime was serving in his home, become the woman holding a child that threatened to destroy his legacy? And what was it about that newborn's face that he could not escape? What truth stared back at him that money, lawyers, and influence could never bury? Behind every closed gate of his mansion, behind every champagne toast at glittering galas, there were whispers. Who's lying? Who's trapped? Who will pay the price when secrets collide with power? This story is not just about a child. It is about survival, reputation, and the lengths one man will go to keep control. Ella Robinson was 29 years old, the kind of woman most people would pass on the street without noticing. Yet she carried a quiet dignity in every step. She worked long hours at the Donovan estate, a sprawling Fairfield property where marble floors echoed with the weight of wealth. Her days began before sunrise and stretched into the late night, ironing shirts that would never crease and polishing glassware that would only be smudged again the next evening. For Ella, work was survival, a steady paycheck to keep her mother's medical bills from piling higher. To those who employed her, she was invisible. But inside her silence lived resilience, and a strength few would see until it was tested. While she labored in the shadows, Marcus Donovan basked in the glare of power, building his fortune through a relentless grip on his tech empire. Marcus Donovan, 45, was the man people whispered about at charity galas and business conferences. Ruthless in the boardroom, untouchable in public, he cultivated an image of perfection that the media adored. His company was his kingdom, his mansion its fortress, and his wealth a shield that kept the world from ever glimpsing the fractures beneath. Yet for all the gold-trimmed portraits and velvet-draped halls, Marcus's life was hollow. Nights alone in cavernous rooms revealed the truth. Money could buy silence, but not peace. Every toast he made was as fragile as the glass it was raised in, every smile rehearsed for a camera flash. He seemed untouchable, but behind that carefully crafted image was a man afraid of losing control. The world of Ella Robinson and Marcus Donovan should never have collided. Yet the winter gala at the Donovan estate changed everything. Guests arrived in black cars, the gates opened to music, and champagne flowed endlessly. For Ella, it was another night of service, carrying trays under chandeliers while her employers celebrated opulence. For Marcus, it was another display of power. But under the shimmer of diamonds and the clinking of glasses, boundaries blurred. Eyes met across a crowded room, and for a moment, silence roared louder than music. No one watching that night could have guessed the chain of events that had just begun, events that would unravel not only reputations, but lives. The winter gala was supposed to be just another evening of spectacle at the Donovan estate. Guests drifted from room to room, sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, while music floated through the halls like smoke. Marcus Donovan was everywhere that night, shaking hands, delivering sharp smiles, playing the host who had it all. Ella Robinson moved through the crowd unseen, balancing trays, offering glasses, disappearing into the edges of opulence. But as the night grew late and the laughter turned louder, Marcus's gaze fixed on her. Perhaps it was the way she avoided his eyes, or the quiet steadiness in her posture that contrasted with the arrogance surrounding them. Whatever it was, Marcus followed the instinct of a man used to getting what he wanted. Near midnight, his voice cut through the noise. "Ella, I need a word with you." She hesitated, but duty carried her into his study. Behind the heavy oak doors of that room, the air was different, thick with liquor and entitlement. Marcus poured himself another drink, his speech slightly slurred, his confidence unchanged. He leaned closer, studying her in the dim light. "You're different, Ella," he said, words coated in false tenderness. For a brief second, she stood frozen, unsure whether this was flattery or a warning. The distance between them collapsed faster than she could comprehend, and in the shadows of leather chairs and shelves lined with books he never read, Marcus crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What unfolded that night was not romance, but betrayal. To the guests outside, the gala never faltered. To Ella Robinson, the silence of the following morning was louder than the music had ever been. In the weeks that followed, Ella carried the memory like a weight she could not set down. Marcus said nothing. His eyes slid past her in the hallways, his words clipped and cold. Then came the dismissal, an envelope with her final paycheck, left without explanation. She walked away with nothing but questions and an emptiness she could not name. Until weeks later, she discovered the truth. The faint sickness, the growing fatigue, the undeniable signs. Ella was pregnant. When she confronted Marcus, his answer came not in words of responsibility, but in numbers. A check for $50,000 was pressed into her palm, a bribe dressed as mercy. "End this," he demanded, his jaw tight, his eyes unflinching. The paper trembled in her hand, but Ella's resolve held stronger than his wealth. She refused. And that refusal led them both to the hospital months later, where everything that had been hidden was forced into the light. In a sterile room thick with the cries of new life, Marcus stood over the child he had tried to erase. His voice, sharp and cold, shattered the fragile calm. "That baby ain't mine." The room froze, nurses exchanging glances, Ella clutching her newborn with trembling arms. Yet when Marcus's eyes fell once more upon the child's face, something flickered. Doubt, recognition, fear. Whatever he saw in that moment was enough to shake his certainty. The confrontation that began with denial ended with a silence far heavier than words. The hospital confrontation did not remain a private matter for long. In a place where walls seemed to have ears, whispers began spreading before Ella Robinson even left the building. Staff members talked of the moment Marcus Donovan pointed at the child and rejected him. Nurses shared hushed conversations in break rooms, weighing class, race, and power in the balance. A story like that could not be contained. It carried the kind of weight that demanded to be told. And once it slipped beyond hospital walls, it gained speed, tumbling into the hands of those eager for scandal. By the time Ella returned home with her baby, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own. When the first media speculation appeared, it was little more than a whisper, tucked inside gossip columns and anonymous blogs. Millionaire scandal? The pieces were vague, hinting at a wealthy Fairfield businessman entangled with a household maid. But vague suggestions quickly hardened into headlines and headlines into narratives. Reporters staked out hospital entrances, snapping photographs of Ella's tired face, turning her into a reluctant figure in a story she never asked to star in. Marcus Donovan, for all his wealth, felt the sharp edge of exposure pressing in. His empire thrived on reputation, and reputations did not survive scandals like this without scars. To protect himself, Marcus turned to the only weapon he trusted more than money: power. He hired a cadre of lawyers, strategists, and publicists to build a narrative that placed him above reproach. Their version of events painted Ella Robinson not as a hardworking woman but as an opportunist. Court filings appeared that described her as unstable, manipulative, and desperate for fortune. "She's just after money," Marcus's representatives told anyone who would listen. To the public, they attempted to recast him as a victim of a malicious scheme. Every press statement was polished, every appearance rehearsed. Yet beneath the surface, cracks in his armor deepened. Ella Robinson, meanwhile, found herself isolated. Neighbors avoided her. Strangers whispered when she passed. Judgment fell heavy on her shoulders, not only for challenging a man of Marcus Donovan's stature, but for daring to keep the child he wanted erased. She clung to her baby as if the small weight in her arms was the only anchor keeping her from being swept away entirely. Nights were long, filled with the cries of a newborn, and the louder cries of a world that refused to believe her. But she endured. Every feeding, every sleepless dawn, every moment of doubt strengthened the bond between mother and child, and deepened her determination to protect him from a legacy of denial. The scandal did not play out cleanly. Red herrings littered the path forward, each one muddying the truth. Rumors surfaced of other men in Ella's life, whispers designed to discredit her claims. Anonymous sources suggested that Marcus might not be the father, that Ella had orchestrated the pregnancy to trap him. Legal teams demanded DNA tests, but the process stalled, delayed by endless motions, appeals, and challenges. Every postponement fueled speculation, and every delay kept the story alive in the press. For Marcus, that meant ongoing humiliation. For Ella, it meant unrelenting scrutiny. Each headline was another wound, another reminder that her life was no longer her own. And through it all, the central question remained unresolved. Who would be believed? The billionaire with everything to lose, or the maid with nothing left but her truth? For months, speculation circled without resolution, until a single detail shattered the doubt. The baby's eyes, storm gray, a shade so rare it seemed almost otherworldly, became the focus of whispers that carried from neighbors to doctors to reporters. It was not just their striking color that drew attention, but their unmistakable resemblance to a line of Donovan ancestors well documented in portraits and photographs. In Marcus Donovan's family, those eyes were a mark, a genetic signature passed down through generations like an unbroken thread. To deny the child was to deny the evidence written across his face. Still, Marcus resisted, clinging to silence as if it might protect him from the truth pressing in. Yet the murmurs grew louder, and soon they reached the ears of the medical community, who would strip the story of rumor and replace it with science. Doctors studied the child with clinical precision. Reports circulated that the probability of such storm gray eyes occurring outside Marcus's lineage was nearly impossible. Too rare for coincidence, one physician noted in a quiet but damning observation. The numbers carried a weight that no lawyer could spin away, no publicist could gloss over. The walls of denial that Marcus had built with his fortune and his pride began to crack under the weight of genetics, of science, of undeniable truth. And still, the question hung in the air like smoke. Would Marcus Donovan finally admit what everyone else could already see? Or would he cling to denial until even the evidence of blood betrayed him? The courtroom became the stage where this truth would play out, a theater of judgment where lives hung in the balance. Ella Robinson entered with quiet resolve, her voice steady but soft as she testified about the night in Marcus's study, the silence that followed, the dismissal that forced her into uncertainty. She spoke of carrying the child alone, of resisting pressure to erase a life that was never hers to end. Each word she delivered was measured, her eyes rarely lifting, but every sentence painted a picture too vivid to ignore. On the other side of the room, Marcus Donovan sat in rigid silence, his jaw set, his gaze fixed anywhere but on the woman who had once served in his home and now stood as his accuser. Every moment in that courtroom carried a tension so sharp it seemed to cut the air. The jurors shifted in their seats. The audience leaned forward, waiting to see whether the man who had built his empire on control would lose it in the face of truth. As testimony unfolded, as evidence was laid bare, the storm-gray eyes of a child seemed to look down on everyone present, demanding acknowledgement. The revelation was no longer a question of science. It was a question of morality, of responsibility, of whether Marcus Donovan could continue to deny what was written so clearly in his son's face. Snow drifted softly across the city the night Marcus Donovan stepped out from the courthouse into the cold. The world expected defiance, a declaration, a carefully crafted statement from a man who had never once been cornered in public. But instead, he stood beneath the awning, his breath heavy in the winter air, staring down at something clenched in his hand. It was the same check he had offered Ella Robinson months before, a symbol of his attempt to erase what could never be undone. Creased, worn, carried like a weight, it had survived every denial, every lie. And then, with one swift motion, Marcus tore it in half, letting the pieces fall into the snow. The act was not redemption, it was theater, a gesture caught between guilt and pride. For all his wealth, Marcus remained a prisoner to himself, a man unwilling to bow to truth, even when it stared him down in the eyes of his own child. Inside the hospital, Ella Robinson sat in the dim light, rocking her newborn with arms both trembling and unyielding. Her exhaustion showed in the lines of her face, in the quiet sobs that escaped between whispered words. She pressed her lips against her baby's forehead and murmured, "You're not a mistake. You're my reason." The words carried no bitterness, no anger, only a quiet vow that she would love fiercely where others had failed, that she would stand where Marcus Donovan had chosen to walk away. The storm-gray eyes blinked up at her, innocent, unknowing, yet carrying the weight of a legacy denied, and so the story lingers unresolved. Did Marcus Donovan ever fully claim his son, acknowledging publicly what he already knew in private? Or did pride win the final battle, leaving truth to live only in the shadows of whispered conversations and haunting glances? In the end, truth is not always shouted from rooftops or carved into courtroom verdicts. Sometimes it exists only in silence, whispered in the eyes of a child who cannot lie. And perhaps that is where this story finds its meaning, not in the power of denial, but in the persistence of truth, carried forward by a life that could never again be erased. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the sky as Marcus Donovan stood alone outside the hospital, his shoulders tense beneath a heavy coat. In his hand, he held the check he had once pressed into Ella Robinson's palm, a sum meant to erase a life, to silence a truth too inconvenient for a man of his stature. The paper was creased from months of being hidden away, folded and unfolded, as if his conscience couldn't quite let it go. For a long moment he stared at it, his face unreadable in the cold night air. Then, without a word, he ripped it in two, letting the pieces scatter into the snow. But the gesture, though striking, was not redemption. It was symbolic, perhaps an admission to himself, though never to the world. To the public, Marcus remained defiant, still cloaked in denial, but in private, the truth haunted him like a shadow he could never escape. Inside the quiet hospital room, Ella Robinson sat cradling her son, her body weary, her spirit fragile but unbroken. She rocked the child gently, tears slipping down her cheeks, and whispered into the silence, "You're not a mistake. You're my reason." Her words were a vow, a promise that she would carry him through every storm, no matter who turned away. The baby stirred in her arms, his storm-gray eyes flickering open, reflecting a truth that no courtroom, no lawyer, no amount of denial could ever erase. In that moment, love was stronger than legacy, and her resolve was greater than his wealth. The story does not end with a verdict or a headline. It ends with questions that remain unanswered. Did Marcus Donovan ever claim his son openly, breaking free of his pride at last? Or did he choose the easier path, allowing silence to stand in place of confession? The answer may never be known, but in the end, truth isn't always shouted. It doesn't always come with applause or recognition. Sometimes it is whispered in the smallest of voices, carried in the steady breath of a child, and seen in the storm-gray eyes that speak louder than denial ever could. What do you think? Was Marcus Donovan blinded by pride, Or was Ella Robinson always destined to fight this battle alone? Was this a story of a man refusing to face the truth, or of a woman finding her strength in the very moment she was most abandoned? These questions linger long after the courtroom lights fade, and the snow covers the torn fragments of a check that could never buy silence. Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming plots.